Every trading card game eventually faces the same problem. A deck becomes too strong, or a combo starts winning too often. Players began asking the same question: why the hell hasn't this card been banned yet, man? The upcoming Cyberpunk TCG hasn't yet revealed how it plans to handle bans, restrictions, or balance updates. Yet, every card game has to find a balance between protecting competitive play and player investment. Ban cards too aggressively, and players become afraid to buy them. Wait too long to act, and a format can become stale, frustrating, and dominated by, at best, a handful of decks that get stale in the third day that they've become the meta. So today, we're looking at how some of the biggest trading card games in the world handle bans, what some newer games are doing differently, and what kind of system might work best for the Cyberpunk TCG. I'm Avin Cry. Welcome back to my channel, and without further ado, let's get into it. Magic the Gathering is probably the first game most people think of when discussing bans, and if we're being honest here, likely just in general, aside from maybe Pokemon. Having been around since, hold on, let me check my notes. Since 1993, it's had decades to experiment with different approaches to balancing its various formats. Today, most Magic the Gathering formats maintain their own ban lists, allowing Wizards of the Coast to address problems without affecting every way the game is played. A card that might be perfectly acceptable in one format can be completely banned and absolutely just broken in another. Magic's philosophy has generally been that if a card or a strategy is creating an unhealthy environment, that it's better to just remove the problem entirely than to force the entire format to revolve around it. This approach has largely helped keep formats fresh, but it's also led to a fair amount of controversy over the years. Players invest significant money into cards, and whenever a ban occurs, there's always debate about whether Wizards acted too soon, waited too long, or targeted the wrong card entirely. Even so, Magic has largely accepted bans as a necessary part of maintaining a competitive game. Of course, as I just previously mentioned, Magic's approach hasn't exactly always been universally praised, we'll say. One of the most controversial examples came in 2024 when the Commander Rules Committee banned, among two other cards, Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus, two of the format's most powerful and expensive cards, which, it was resulted in some very untoward and unkind and just sometimes downright devious behavior, which I do not endorse at all and heavily recommend that you steer away from in any capacity. But moving back into the example, while many players agreed that the cards were extremely strong, others felt blindsided by the decision and argued that banning highly sought after cards damaged player confidence. The backlash was significant enough to spark debate through the entire Commander community about who should be making ban decisions and what factors should be considered beyond pure game balance. And this wasn't the first time Magic found itself in a difficult position. Cards like Oko, Thief of Crowns, Hogak, Arisen Necropolis, and Oro, Titan of Nature's Wrath all spent periods dominating competitive play before eventually being banned in multiple formats. In some cases, players felt Wizards acted too slowly, allowing unhealthy formats to persist for months. In others, players felt that the company acted way too quickly. Magic's history demonstrates that even when a ban is objectively correct from a balance perspective, the timing and the communication surrounding that decision can be just as important as the decision itself. Ultimately, Magic the Gathering teaches us that bans are sometimes necessary, but the timing, communication, and the impact on player investment can be just as important as the ban itself. Pokemon, on the other hand, takes a very different approach. While the game certainly does have some banned cards, they are relatively uncommon compared to many other TCGs. Instead, Pokemon relies heavily on rotation. Every year, older sets leave the standard format, naturally removing many cards that might otherwise become problematic over time. Because of this system, the Pokemon Company often doesn't need to ban cards nearly as aggressively as other games. If a card becomes an issue later in its lifespan, then rotation simply may solve the problem without any direct intervention being needed. This creates a very different relationship between players and the game. Rather than constantly worrying about bans, players will generally know when a card will leave standard and can plan accordingly. The trade off, of course, is that rotation doesn't always help when a brand new card proves problematic, especially when it does so almost immediately after release. Players may find themselves stuck with a problematic deck or strategy for months, waiting for new cards, rule changes, or just eventually the rotation itself to address the issue. One example often discussed by competitive players is how certain dominant archetypes have occasionally remained at the top of the metagame for extended periods of time because they weren't technically broken enough to warrant bans. While Pokemon generally avoids the controversy associated with its frequent ban lists, critics argue that this approach can sometimes result in slower responses to emerging balancing problems. Pokemon teaches us that a healthy rotation system can solve many balance problems just naturally, reducing the need for bans while giving players predictable expectations for the future, even if it isn't without its various amount of issues. Yu-Gi-Oh! Occupies an interesting middle ground. Rather than relying primarily on bans or rotation, Konami uses one of the most famous restriction systems in trading card games. Cards can be forbidden, meaning that they can't be played at all, limited to one copy, or just semi-limited to two copies. This allows the developers to fine-tune the power level of strategies without necessarily removing them entirely. Over time, this system has become one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most defining characteristics. Entire competitive formats can shift drastically based on a single update to either the forbidden or the limited list. Players have become accustomed to seeing decks weaken through restrictions rather than outright bans whenever possible. While controversial at times, like most things are if we're being honest, the system gives Konami way more flexibility than any other game that relies solely on just banning cards outright. Because Konami has so many tools available, players sometimes feel that decisions are inconsistent. Certain decks have remained powerful throughout multiple list updates, while other strategies were hit repeatedly in a short period of time. There have also been some situations where limiting cards has just entirely failed to solve the underlying issue. Instead of weakening a deck, restrictions sometimes merely changed which versions of the deck players chose to run. In those cases, multiple list updates were required before the format was able to finally stabilize. Yu-Gi-Oh! Shows us that while restrictions can be a powerful alternative to bans, sure, they aren't always a perfect solution on their own. Yu-Gi-Oh! Teaches us, ultimately, that the balance doesn't have to be a choice between doing nothing and banning a card entirely. Restrictions and limitations can provide valuable middle ground solutions instead. Flesh and Blood also takes a unique approach compared to most major TCGs through its Living Legends system. Rather than relying exclusively on bans or rotation, heroes accumulate points based on tournament success. Once a hero earns enough points, they leave the primary competitive format and become Living Legend. This naturally removes dominant decks from the environment without necessarily banning the cards themselves. In addition to the Living Legend system, Legend Story Studios still maintains traditional tools such as suspensions, bans, and restrictions when necessary. This gives the game multiple layers of balance management. Rather than treating every problem the same way, Flesh and Blood attempts to match the solution to the severity of the issue, whether that's a simple suspension, card ban, or just allowing a hero to gradually rotate through competitive success. However, this system hasn't been without criticism. Once again, like most things are, some players argue that successful heroes can eventually be pushed out of the format simply because they performed well, rather than because they became unhealthy. Others have pointed to situations where dominant decks have remained at the top for extended periods of time while accumulating enough living legend points to finally rotate out. This has led to some players questioning whether the system occasionally prioritizes long term health over immediate balance concerns that are sometimes needed. Flesh and Blood ultimately teaches us that creative systems can accomplish many of the same goals as bans and rotations, and that having multiple tools available is most often better than just relying on a single solution. Moving on to much more recent TCGs now. The One Piece card game has had the advantage of launching into an era where developers already understand many of the challenges that come with maintaining a competitive card game. Bandai has shown a willingness to intervene when necessary, but often prefers to use restrictions and targeted adjustment before completely removing cards from the game. Part of this approach comes from recognizing how modern players interact with TCGs. Cards can become expensive very, very, very quickly sometimes, and frequent bans can damage consumer confidence. By using restrictions and carefully targeted updates, One Piece attempts to maintain balance while minimizing the impact on players who have invested time and money into particular decks. While One Piece has generally been praised for its measured approach, it has also experienced periods where certain leaders and strategies became overwhelmingly dominant. Decks such as, and I already know I'm saying this wrong, so I'm sorry, such as Sakazuki generated significant discussion within the community, with how many players arguing that intervention should have happened way sooner than it ultimately did. These situations ultimately highlight a challenge shared by many modern game developers, often wanting to avoid overreacting, but then waiting too long and creating frustration among competitive players. One Piece teaches us ultimately that protecting player investment is important, but developers must still be willing to act before frustrations begin to outweigh the confidence in the game. Star Wars Unlimited is still relatively young, but one of the most interesting aspects of the game's approach so far has been its emphasis on collecting data before major balance decisions. Rather than immediately reacting to every strong deck that emerges, the developers have generally emphasized monitoring tournament results and overall format health. This reflects a broader trend in modern game designs. Many developers have become increasingly cautious about overcorrecting formats. A deck that appears dominant one month may naturally decline as players discover counters and new strategies emerge. By exercising restraint, Star Wars Unlimited appears to be prioritizing long term stability over frequent intervention. The challenge with a patient, data driven approach is that players don't always want to wait for the data. If a particular deck feels oppressive, even if temporarily, community sentiment can shift pretty quickly. Players may begin demanding action long before the statistics suggest that intervention is necessary at all. While Star Wars Unlimited has generally avoided balanced controversy so far, the game's philosophy will eventually face the same test that every growing TCG encounters, deciding whether a format is genuinely unhealthy or just simply unconquered. The longer developers wait to act, the more and more pressure they'll face from the players that already convinced that action was already overdue about 2 weeks ago. Ultimately, though, Star Wars Unlimited teaches us the importance of patience and data driven decision making. A strong deck isn't automatically broken, and not every single problem requires immediate intervention. Disney Lorcana entered the market like most Disney products do, carrying enormous expectations, and with those came significant scrutiny regarding how the game would handle balance issues. So far, Lorcana has generally avoided aggressive use of bans, instead allowing metagames to develop as new sets enter the environment. This approach mirrors, as we've seen with the previous newer TCGs we've discussed, a growing belief among modern TCG designers that not every strong card requires immediate action. Sometimes a future expansion can introduce answers to an existing problem without requiring either restrictions or bans. While that philosophy, as many do, carries some risk, it also allows players to feel a lot more secure about investing in a game without constantly worrying that key cards might become suddenly illegal when they check social media the next morning. However, Lorcana's hands-off approach carries its own risks as well, as with pretty much every approach does, if we're being honest. Because while future card releases can sometimes solve today's problems, there's never any guarantee that they actually will. If a problematic strategy remains dominant for too long, players can become frustrated, waiting for a solution that may still be months away, and then not even solve the problem that it's meant to. This is one of the central balancing acts facing modern TCGs. Intervene too quickly, players feel punished for investing in cards. Intervene too slowly, and players begin to lose faith in the competitive environment. Lorcana illustrates that choosing not to act is still a decision, and that decisions carry consequences just like any ban does as well. Ultimately, Disney Lorcana teaches us that sometimes the best answer to a dominant strategy isn't a ban, but just allowing the metagame and future card releases the opportunity to adapt and respond, almost in a similar way to Pokemon's rotation structure. Before moving on, there are two other games worth mentioning in my opinion. First off, the Gundam card game, as well as Riot Games Riftbound. The reason I'm grouping these together is that they're actually in a pretty similar situation in Cyberpunk TCG right now. Both games have generated plenty of excitement. Both come from companies with experience managing competitive games, and both already have communities wondering how are the balance issues going to be handled in the future. The interesting thing is that we simply don't know yet. Neither game has existed long enough for us to see what their long-term philosophy toward bans, restrictions, errata, or just balance updates are going to look like. We can make educated guesses, sure, based on the companies behind them, but until the truly format warping card or dominant strategy emerges, because it always will, we won't know how they'll respond. In a way, that puts them in the same category as the Cyberpunk TCG, really. Before any game has its first major balance crisis, every ban looks good on paper. The real test, though, comes when a deck starts dominating tournaments, when players start demanding action, and the developers have to decide exactly where they're going to draw their line in the sand. That's what makes Cyberpunk's situation so interesting to me. The game still has the opportunity to learn from decades of TCG history before it faces the moment itself, just like the Gundam card game and just like Riot Games Riftbound. So, what should the Cyberpunk TCG do? After spending a couple hours going through each game's spanning philosophies and methods to balance updates and such, admittedly probably a little less than I should have, yet still doing it all the same, I think that the Cyberpunk TCG should primarily focus on following the One Piece card game's example. Not because it has a perfect system, because it absolutely doesn't, and such a perfect system just doesn't exist and never will for a trading card game, but because it recognizes that there's an entire spectrum between doing nothing and outright banning a card, while also keeping player investment in mind, which continues to be more and more important as trading card game markets and such keep growing and growing and growing. The restriction system gives developers more tools to work with. If a card is too strong, then maybe it just needs to be limited. If the strategy is absolutely dominating, then perhaps a targeted restriction is enough to bring it back in line. And if something truly threatens the health of the game, then bans still remain on the table available as a last resort. At the same time, the Cyberpunk TCG shouldn't simply copy the One Piece card game. Magic the Gathering teaches us the importance of decisive action. Pokemon shows the value of having cards naturally leave the environment over time. Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! Demonstrate that creative alternatives can exist outside traditional rotation and ban lists, and just the norm at the time, really. Lorcana shows that sometimes the metagame can solve its own problems given enough time and the right card releases, and Star Wars Unlimited teaches patience and the importance of gathering data before reacting too rashly. The good news for the Cyberpunk TCG is that it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. It has decades of trading card game history to learn from. Every success, every failure, every controversial ban, every dominant deck, and every frustrated player has already provided more than enough lessons for it to learn from. The real question is whether Cyberpunk's developers will learn from that history or be doomed to repeat it. Ultimately, for me, at least, this video wasn't exactly about deciding the one correct way to handle bans, because it really straight up isn't. It was more about looking back at the history of trading card games and learning from the successes, the mistakes, and just the lessons that they've accumulated over the years. With the Cyberpunk TCG still in its infancy, we have a very unique opportunity to ask what kind of system we want before the game ever faces its first major balance crisis. The encouraging part for me, though, at least, is that Witko's already shown a great willingness to listen to community feedback and make adjustments when necessary, even this early into the game's development, which is already a lot better than most games just in general. So big ups from me on that part. Um, whether that translates into future ban policies, restrictions, errata, or something entirely different that remains to be seen. But it's a positive sign that the developers are paying attention to the community from the very beginning. And little personal announcement as well, but I'm actually going to be attending the Los Angeles Anime Expo on Thursday and Friday. So probably not Saturday, but I could be there in the morning. Have some plans for the later half of the day. Obviously, with it being 4th of July, gonna go celebrate, blow some stuff up. Legally, of course, for legal reasons. Definitely doing everything legal. Never broken a law in my life, officer. My last name is actually Mr. Goody Two Shoes. So Mr. is just in there as well. Uh, and then Sunday, I already have family plans and just plans with family friends as well. So can't make it Sunday, but yeah, I'll definitely be there Thursday and Friday. So that should be fun. Hopefully, I'll be able to demo the new decks and meet. And I apologize for saying this wrong just right off the bat, Miss Cesares or Cazares or however you say it properly. I'm sorry. But I expect Friday to be the busiest the Cyberpunk TCG booth's going to be. Maybe Thursday with everyone kind of rushing to get the new Rebecca promo, which hopefully I'll get. I'm going to be honest, I really want it because it looks really nice. And Rebecca is possibly my most favorite Cyberpunk character. Depends on the day, really. But Sasha's pretty up there as well, personally. But yeah, reason I'm telling you this though, for the most part, is because I want you to give me any questions that you have for the dev team, because I'm hopefully going to be able to have a conversation with some of them, be able to talk with them about some questions I have, and I'm like 90% sure you guys got questions too. And I mean, even if you're just giving them to like a random stranger on the internet whose video you just watched, it's better than just getting another soon emote on the Discord, you know? So why not, you know? Better than nothing. Um, but with that, mainly, thank you for watching. And yeah, thank you for watching all the way to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed this kind of content, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more Cyberpunk TCG discussion, analysis, and if we're being honest, mainly news as we get closer to the official launch of Set 1. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the video as well. Do you agree with my conclusions? Is there a ban system from another TCG that you think Cyberpunk should take inspiration from that I didn't really look into or kind of just forgot? Or is there something, yeah, that I just completely overlooked? Let me know down in the comments because I read every single one. Promise. Uh, okay, I'm tired. The suit, it looks nice, but it's a bit of a pain to wear. And yeah, I really want to take this off. I'm going to go listen to Bad Bunny. Until next time, stay safe out there, Chooms. See ya. Ciao.